In December 2000, just days before Christmas, Texas suburb became the backdrop for a nightmare that would shock the entire nation. Officer Aubrey Hawkins, a devoted husband, father, and police officer, was responding to a robbery call in Irving, Texas. But what he didn't know was that he was walking straight into an ambush orchestrated by 7 violent fugitives who had escaped from a maximum security prison just days earlier. The man behind it all? George Rivas, charismatic, calculating, and already serving a life sentence for kidnapping and armed robbery. His plan to break out of prison was executed with military precision. But once on the outside, his leadership turned deadly. Officer Hawkins never stood a chance. Shot 11 times and run over, his brutal murder left a community shattered. It would take a nationwide manhunt, public outrage, and 11 long years on death row before Rivas would finally face the needle and deliver his chilling final words. To understand this shocking case, we have to go back to where it all began. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell icon because this is the kind of case that stays with you long after the screen fades to black. George Angel Rivas Jr. was born on May 6, 1970 in El Paso, Texas, a border town where cultures blend, opportunities flicker, and the American dream often feels just out of reach. Raised in a modest, working-class household, Rivas grew up in a neighborhood filled with the hum of hard-working families, the smell of homemade food wafting from small kitchens, and the sound of parents urging their children to aim higher than the circumstances they were born into. By most accounts, his early life gave no obvious signals of what would come. He wasn't abused. He wasn't raised in chaos. There were no early arrests or red flags waving in front of the system. If anything, he blended into the background, a quiet kid with average grades, a bit of charm, and a tendency to observe more than he spoke. As he entered adulthood, Rivas worked a series of ordinary jobs that reflected his blue-collar environment: convenience store clerk, short-order cook, construction laborer. Co-workers described him as punctual and smart, but there was something more behind the eyes. He had a mind that didn't match the roles he was handed. He was methodical, precise, even obsessive about routines. But underneath that unassuming exterior, a different personality was forming, one shaped by a hunger for power, control, and significance. That desire would eventually manifest in a terrifying way. In the mid-1990s, George Rivas shifted from a life of labor to a life of crime. And it wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate. He began orchestrating a series of calculated robberies in El Paso, many involving armed confrontations and hostage-taking. These weren't smash-and-grab jobs by a desperate man. These were planned attacks, executed with military-style coordination. In one instance, he and his accomplices kidnapped victims at gunpoint, held them for hours, and forced them to comply under the threat of death. Rivas wasn't chaotic or emotional. He was calm, direct, and terrifyingly in control. His victims, who survived with scars that ran deeper than flesh, described him as a man who showed no fear and no remorse, just the cold focus of someone who had already accepted the consequences. Eventually, law enforcement caught up with him. He was charged and convicted in El Paso County on a staggering list of felonies: 13 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 4 counts of aggravated robbery, and 1 count of burglary of a habitation, all committed with a deadly weapon. The courtroom testimony painted the picture of a man with the demeanor of a CEO and the heart of a predator. He was sentenced to life in prison but not to death. The system assumed that would be enough to contain him. Incarcerated at the maximum security Connally Unit in Kennedy, Texas, Rivas didn't disappear into obscurity like most lifers. Instead, he studied the environment like a tactician. He paid attention to guard rotations, schedules, structural weaknesses, and behavioral patterns. He also began surrounding himself with inmates who had something to offer: skills, loyalty, and above all, desperation. He became a leader not through fear but through persuasion and discipline. Fellow inmates didn't just follow him, they trusted him. He was articulate, thoughtful, and patient, rare traits in a prison setting. He worked in maintenance, giving him access to tools and knowledge of the facility's layout. He earned the reputation of being a model inmate on the surface, but behind closed doors he was carefully crafting an escape plan that would become one of the most infamous in U.S. history. His attention to detail was borderline obsessive. He choreographed the plan like a heist movie, calculating timing down to the second, recruiting 6 other inmates with complementary skills, and ensuring every piece of the puzzle would be in place when the time came. 4 months, they drilled the plan in secret, rehearsing every step from overtaking civilian workers to infiltrating the prison armory to securing weapons, radios, and a getaway vehicle. And all the while, prison staff remained largely unaware, misled by the facade of routine. But George Rivas wasn't playing the long game to escape and run. He wanted more than freedom. He wanted legacy. December 13, 2000. A date that would forever be etched in Texas prison history. It was a day like any other at the John B. Connally Unit in Kennedy, Texas. The sky was overcast, the compound buzzed with the usual monotony of controlled routines, and guards monitored from towers like sentinels guarding the gates of a forgotten world. But deep within the prison's walls, beneath the routine and rigidity, a storm was brewing. George Rivas, the self-appointed mastermind of what would become known as the Texas 7, was about to execute the plan he had meticulously prepared for months, possibly years. The Connally Unit was designed to hold Texas's worst offenders. High fences lined with razor wire, armed guards and watchtowers, surveillance cameras, metal detectors. It was a fortress. And yet, that didn't intimidate Rivas. To him it wasn't a wall, it was a maze. And he had found the path out. At approximately 11:20 a.m., Rivas and 6 other inmates, Larry Harper, Michael Rodriguez, Donald Newberry, Joseph Garcia, Randy Halpern, and Patrick Murphy, began to quietly disappear from their assigned jobs in the prison's maintenance and kitchen areas. Their roles had been strategically selected over time. Each man placed in a specific location that gave them access to tools, uniforms, information, and most importantly, mobility. The first phase was simple but dangerous: overpower civilian workers. Using shanks, tools, and sheer force, they subdued a total of 9 prison employees and 4 fellow inmates, including maintenance supervisors and unarmed guards. They tied them up, duct-taped their mouths, and stashed them in a utility room. Some of the victims would later say that the men, particularly Rivas, spoke calmly, even respectfully, but made it clear they wouldn't hesitate to kill if necessary. Once the victims were restrained, the 7 convicts began the next phase: deception. Wearing stolen maintenance uniforms and guard jackets, Rivas and his crew moved through the prison grounds posing as workers conducting routine jobs. With stolen keys and radio codes, they navigated restricted areas and gained access to the prison armory. There they made their move, stealing an arsenal of weapons: 14 pistols, 3 shotguns, and a rifle, along with ammunition, bulletproof vests, and handcuffs. They even grabbed a 2-way radio and a police scanner. It wasn't just brute force, it was psychological warfare. They used the stolen radio to monitor guards' movements and respond with fake dispatches to create confusion. They had rehearsed phrases, signals, and escape triggers. Everything was timed. Then came the final phase: escape. The men hijacked a prison maintenance truck, driving it to the back gate under the guise of a work detail. A disguised Rivas distracted the tower guard with a fake maintenance request, while another inmate quickly and quietly overrode the security gate. In under an hour and a half they were gone. 7 men fully armed, driving off the prison grounds without a single gunshot fired. The gates of a maximum security prison had been breached, not with explosions or chaos, but with planning, patience, and precision. By the time the escape was discovered, the convicts were long gone. They abandoned the prison vehicle and switched to a getaway car that had been strategically stashed by a family member of one of the inmates. Rivas and his crew melted into the Texas landscape, armed and ready for whatever came next. The prison was thrown into total lockdown. Sirens blared. Helicopters swarmed the skies. Officers from across the state were mobilized. But the fugitives had the advantage of time, and a terrifying willingness to escalate. In their place, the escapees left behind a chilling message, scribbled on a dry erase board in the prison break room. "You haven't heard the last of us yet." That statement wasn't just bravado, it was a promise. Because Rivas didn't just want freedom. He wanted to make a mark. And as the days passed, it became clear: these men weren't going into hiding, they were preparing for war. Within hours, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, U.S. Marshals, FBI, and local law enforcement launched a full-scale manhunt. A massive media campaign began. Warnings were issued statewide. And soon the entire country knew the name, Texas 7. But no one knew where they were going, or who would be caught in their path. December 24, 2000. While most families across the country were enjoying Christmas Eve in the warm company of loved ones, the city of Irving, Texas was about to lose one of its finest. What began as a cold, calculated robbery by escaped fugitives known as the Texas 7 would end in the brutal slaying of a young police officer, father, and husband, Officer Aubrey Hawkins, just 29 years old. Aubrey Hawkins wasn't just another officer in uniform. He was a family man, a devoted husband, and a loving father to his 9-year-old son. Those who knew him described him as humble, soft-spoken, and deeply committed to his community and profession. Raised with strong values, Hawkins had joined the Irving Police Department with the hope of making a difference, not just through enforcement but through compassion and presence. He had worked hard, earned the respect of his peers, and was known to volunteer for extra shifts during the holidays so fellow officers with kids could stay home. He never complained. He simply did what was right. But that Christmas Eve shift would be his last. At approximately 6 p.m., while shoppers were finishing up their last-minute Christmas buying spree, 7 armed fugitives, George Rivas, Joseph Garcia, Michael Rodriguez, Larry Harper, Donald Newberry, Randy Halpern, and Patrick Murphy, arrived at Oshman's sporting goods store in Irving. By now they were desperate for weapons, cash, and gear to continue evading law enforcement. Rivas, the ringleader, directed the operation like a military commander. Wearing stolen security uniforms and carrying multiple firearms and two-way radios, the Texas 7 gained access to the store under the guise of a security inspection. Once inside, they quickly overpowered the employees, herding them into a break room and zip-tying their hands behind their backs. Calm, efficient, and terrifyingly prepared, they made no secret of their intentions. This was a full-scale robbery, and they would leave no witnesses if necessary. Outside, Misty Wright, the girlfriend of one of the employees, sat in her car waiting. She noticed something strange. Through the store's front window, she saw the employees with their hands raised high above their heads. Alarmed, she called the police. The call came through dispatch, and Officer Aubrey Hawkins, who had been grabbing a quick meal nearby, immediately responded. He was alone in his patrol vehicle but didn't hesitate. That's who he was, always ready, always first in line to help. At 6:24 p.m., he radioed in that he was approaching the scene. It would be the last transmission he'd ever make. Hawkins pulled into the rear of the Oshman store. Unaware of the exact situation, he entered the alley by the loading dock, precisely where the escapees had stationed lookouts. The moment his cruiser turned the corner, he was ambushed in a flurry of gunfire. The attack was swift and merciless. Trial evidence later revealed that Hawkins was shot 11 times by at least 5 different firearms, from 3 different directions. Hollow point rounds tore through his uniform. One bullet hit his spine. Another pierced his head. He never stood a chance. Before his cruiser had even come to a full stop, he was gone. But the horror didn't end there. As Hawkins's lifeless body lay slumped in the vehicle, several of the escapees dragged him from his patrol car and stripped him of his service weapon and badge. In the chaos, George Rivas himself, already wounded by friendly fire, jumped into the getaway SUV, a Ford Explorer belonging to Donald Newberry's friend, and in his haste to flee, ran over Hawkins's body, dragging him approximately 10 feet across the asphalt. The group fled with over $70,000 in cash, 44 stolen firearms, ammunition, camping equipment, and the wallets and jewelry of employees. The audacity of the crime sent shockwaves across Texas. 1 officer murdered in cold blood. Dozens of innocent employees traumatized. 7 fugitives now fully armed and mobile, moving north toward Colorado. In the aftermath, the city of Irving was left to mourn. Officer Aubrey Hawkins's patrol car, riddled with bullets, became a memorial adorned with flowers, flags, and handwritten letters. His wife and young son were shattered by the loss. The department too was broken. Christmas would never be the same. His funeral drew officers from around the country. Bagpipes played. Salutes were given. Tears flowed as fellow officers carried his casket. The entire state of Texas had lost a hero that night. But even in death, Hawkins became a symbol of bravery, of a man who responded to a call, knowing full well the dangers, and who made the ultimate sacrifice doing what he loved. And for George Rivas, the architect of the entire operation, this murder would seal his fate. After their bold and deadly robbery of Oshman's sporting goods, which resulted in the cold-blooded execution of Officer Aubrey Hawkins, the Texas 7 vanished into the folds of the American landscape. Their flight from justice didn't slow down, instead it intensified. George Rivas, the ringleader, remained calculating and in control. He and the other 6 fugitives, Joseph Garcia, Michael Rodriguez, Larry Harper, Patrick Murphy, Randy Halpern, and Donald Newberry, continued their spree, robbing multiple locations to fund their new lives. Surveillance footage from small-town banks and local hardware stores across Texas and neighboring states showed flashes of armed men in masks, brutal, efficient, and gone within minutes. These weren't just petty criminals anymore. They were becoming infamous. They had cash. They had weapons. They had each other. But what they didn't have was time. Knowing the nation was on high alert, they realized Texas was too hot. The group set their sights north, eventually arriving in the small mountain town of Woodland Park, Colorado, a sleepy place known more for its quiet snow-covered landscapes than fugitives from justice. There, nestled among working-class families and retirees, the Texas 7 began living under assumed names in Coachlight Mobile Home Park, a low-rent trailer park with a view of Pikes Peak. George Rivas took on the alias Joseph Gonzalez. The rest of the crew adopted fake identities too, some going as far as to grow facial hair or cut their hair short, diet, or wear glasses. They told neighbors they were a group of Christian missionaries doing community work. They handed out religious pamphlets, volunteered to help elderly neighbors with home repairs, and kept a low profile. But behind the doors of their modest trailer, things looked different. Inside, the fugitives kept a stockpile of guns, ammunition, and stolen cash. The trailer itself was purchased using money from their robberies and outfitted with supplies they had looted along their journey. They had even stolen police scanners to monitor local law enforcement chatter. And to further their cover story, they put up religious signs in their window, phrases like "Jesus saves" and "God is love," all while planning their next move. Their plan was to wait out the storm, maybe even escape to Mexico. But in a country obsessed with justice, anonymity doesn't last long. Meanwhile, back in Texas, the murder of Officer Hawkins had rocked the law enforcement community. Irving Police, the Texas Rangers, the U.S. Marshals, and the FBI launched a joint task force with one singular goal: capture the Texas 7. A $500,000 reward was announced. Their mugshots were printed on every newspaper across the state. Their faces were broadcast in post offices, police stations, rest stops, and gas stations across the Southwest. But it was a call to one of the most powerful tools in law enforcement's arsenal that would finally break the case open. On January 20, 2001, the case was featured on America's Most Wanted, the long-running TV show hosted by John Walsh that had helped capture hundreds of fugitives. That night, millions of Americans sat glued to their screens as the show detailed the prison escape, the murder of Officer Hawkins, and the nationwide manhunt. They showed dramatic reenactments, mugshots, and close-up shots of the escapees, urging viewers to come forward with any tips. The response was almost immediate. Within 48 hours, a viewer in Colorado recognized two of the men from their neighborhood in Woodland Park and called the FBI. The tips set off a rapid chain of events. On January 22, 2001, federal agents and local law enforcement surrounded the Coachlight trailer park with rifles drawn and SWAT teams in position. Inside the trailer, the Texas 7 had no illusions. They knew it was over. Most surrendered without resistance. But Larry Harper, who had long told the others he would never go back to prison, barricaded himself inside a small RV on the property. Negotiators pleaded with him for hours. But Harper was resolute. In a final act of defiance, he took his own life with a single gunshot, ending his story on his own terms rather than face life or death behind bars. As the dust settled on one of the most high-profile manhunts in American history, the courtroom became the final battleground for justice. It was here, under the bright lights of the legal system, that the story of the Texas 7 would begin its closing chapter. A dramatic, emotional, and deeply sobering confrontation between law and lawlessness. In 2001, the first of the escapees to face the full weight of justice was George Rivas, the self-proclaimed mastermind of the escape and the Oshman's robbery. Prosecutors wasted no time painting Rivas as the calculated architect behind both the prison break and the ruthless murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins. They laid bare the disturbing reality of Rivas's leadership, how he organized, commanded, and empowered a crew of desperate men to violently reclaim their freedom at any cost, even the life of a police officer doing his duty on Christmas Eve. The courtroom fell silent as audio recordings, surveillance footage, and forensics were presented. Testimonies detailed how Rivas had meticulously planned the prison break for months while behind bars, convincing fellow inmates that they could beat the system and rewrite their destiny. But his destiny was now at hand, facing a jury of 12 citizens and the grieving eyes of a murdered officer's widow. And in a moment that stunned the courtroom, Rivas addressed the jury during the sentencing phase. Calm and resolute, he spoke with a chilling blend of defiance and surrender. "What you call the death penalty," he declared, "I call freedom." It was a statement that echoed across the courtroom like a gunshot, raw, unapologetic, and twisted in logic. For him, death was not punishment, it was escape. But for the family of Officer Hawkins, it was closure they needed. The prosecution emphasized Rivas's leadership role, noting how he directed the others during the prison escape and robbery. Witness after witness described the coordinated ambush that left Officer Hawkins no time to defend himself. Emotional testimonies from the Hawkins family brought the gravity of the crime into sharp, human focus. His widow took the stand, her voice trembling as she spoke about their last Christmas together, and the agony of telling their young son that his father would never come home. Ultimately, the jury found George Rivas guilty of capital murder, and he was sentenced to death. It was a unanimous verdict. There were no tears from Rivas, only a hardened stare and a subtle nod, as if acknowledging the final chapter of the book he had written with blood. Following Rivas's conviction, the other members of the Texas Seven were each tried individually in different Texas counties, all of them facing charges related to the escape, armed robberies, and most notably, the murder of Officer Hawkins. Joseph Garcia, Michael Rodriguez, Donald Newberry, Patrick Murphy, and Randy Halpern were all found guilty of capital murder and received either death sentences or life imprisonment. Their fates would be sealed by their participation in the killing of a police officer, a charge Texas does not take lightly. One of the men, Michael Rodriguez, would later volunteer for execution, expressing remorse and citing religious reasons for wanting to end his appeals. Others, like Patrick Murphy, would see their executions delayed by legal challenges and arguments about their individual roles in the murder, whether they fired the gun or merely stood watch. But the court had made one thing clear: the death of Officer Aubrey Hawkins was not the result of one man's actions, but the collective will of 7 fugitives united in violence. And for that, each would carry the burden of accountability. After being sentenced to death in 2001 for the capital murder of Officer Aubrey Hawkins, George Rivas was transferred to the Connally Unit in Livingston, Texas, home to Texas death row. Inside the walls of this grim facility, Rivas spent more than a decade awaiting his fate, housed in solitary confinement 23 hours a day. Fellow inmates described him as a calm and introspective figure, often reading, writing letters, and reflecting on his past. In several interviews he expressed remorse, not necessarily for the robberies or the escape, but for the loss of Officer Hawkins' life. Rivas gave a haunting interview in 2009, describing how the years on death row had mentally and spiritually transformed him. He claimed to have found peace through faith and often quoted scripture in his letters. While he never denied his role as the mastermind behind the Texas 7 escape, he maintained that Hawkins' death was never part of the plan. As his execution date approached in early 2012, Rivas declined most legal appeals and refused to seek clemency, telling his attorneys and family that he was ready to go. To many, it was a calculated acceptance of responsibility, but to others, it was a final act of control from a man who had orchestrated one of the most brazen prison escapes in Texas history. Date: February 29, 2012, a leap day rare and symbolic. Location: Huntsville Unit, Huntsville, Texas. Time of execution: 6:22 p.m. The air outside the Huntsville Unit was thick with tension and protest as demonstrators for and against the death penalty stood in silent anticipation. Inside, George Rivas was finishing his final preparations. He declined the traditional spiritual advisor but allowed his wife to visit. In his final hours, he remained composed and expressed peace with his fate. His last meal was standard fare, as Texas had eliminated special last meal requests in 2011. Rivas ate the same food as the rest of the inmates: baked chicken, mashed potatoes with country gravy, green beans, sliced bread, and a beverage. The era of elaborate last meal choices was over, fitting for a man who once tried to control every detail of his life, now left with no choices at all. At 6 p.m., he was led into the death chamber, strapped onto the gurney under bright lights and heavy observation. Witnesses from both the victim's family and Rivas' own were present behind the glass. When asked for his final statement, Rivas turned his head toward the witnesses and said, "First of all, for the Aubrey Hawkins family, I do apologize for everything that happened. Not because I'm here but for closure in your hearts. I really do believe you deserve that." Rivas then expressed love to his wife, sister, son, other friends and family, and his fellow death row inmates. "Thank you to the people involved and the courtesy of the officers. I am grateful for everything in my life. To my wife, take care of yourself. I will be waiting for you. I love you. God bless. I am ready to go." At exactly 6:22 p.m., George Rivas was pronounced dead after receiving a lethal dose of pentobarbital. There were no complications. No struggle. Just a final exhale. Outside the unit, Officer Hawkins' widow wept quietly, surrounded by family, while other police officers stood solemnly in uniform. Justice in their eyes had been served. For the mastermind of the Texas 7, the long road from prison escape to execution had come to an irreversible end. Another name added to the list of the executed. Another victim remembered. Another reminder that choices define destiny. If this story gripped you, shook you, Opened your eyes to the dark corners of justice and crime in America? Then don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button for more jaw-dropping true crime stories that dig deeper than headlines. Smash the like if you believe Officer Aubrey Hawkins deserves to be remembered, not just as a cop, but as a father, a husband, a hero. And share this video with someone who thinks they've seen it all, because trust me, the Texas 7 is just the beginning. New stories, real cases, no filters, only on this channel. Stay locked in.